While global warming grabs the headlines, there's another environmental disaster unfolding. The world is running out of fresh water. Even here in Canada, the supply of fresh water is shrinking. How did the world's largest resource become so threatened, and what can be done about it? Political activist Maude Barlow addresses these and other issues in her new book, Blue Covenant: The Global Water Crisis and the Coming Battle for the Right to Water. You used to come on the show and we would talk about nationalism and foreign ownership in Canada. Last time and now you're talking about water. This has become your new mission. What is it about this issue that has captured your attention, time, and passion?
Well, it actually started with the same kind of issues and concerns when we asserted that water was in the trade agreements in NAFTA as a tradable good. And therefore Canada was water is at risk, and I still say that, but I couldn't stop there with the issue. The more I traveled, and I do travel a great deal in the third world particularly, and the more I put this analysis together about seeing how the water systems, the water resources, the supply is actually drying up in the world.
Well, the book says it's a very grim story.
It's a very grim story.
Let's start to talk to me about supply.
Well, here's the thing. We all learned back in about grade 5 that there's a closed hydrologic cycle and the water can't go anywhere.
So
not true.
We're not supposed to run out.
We're not supposed to run out. And we haven't run out technically. The water's somewhere, but we can't get at it or we've destroyed it. Here's the story really briefly. We have polluted, humanity has polluted, particularly in the third world, surface water that people used for millennia. So you don't have that river or lake. 80% of China's surface water is polluted beyond use. 75% of India's water, just as 2 examples. So we are using modern technology with these huge high-tech bores, and we are boring down into the groundwater. We're taking up water faster than it can be replenished, and so we are now using the next level of water. And those stats are absolutely stunning. We're also taking water from where it exists in nature, in those aquifers or in watersheds, and we're watering deserts. And then you create a second desert, so we're creating huge amounts of desert. Or we use it to water huge cities, which then dump it into the ocean, so you're not returning it to the cycle. Or we pave over everything, and so that cycle's interrupted because it doesn't have green stuff to come back to, which for the transpiration process. I'm working with scientists who are actually able to quantify that for every percentage of paving over, we're actually losing rain from the hydrologic cycle, and they talk about the right of domicile of a drop of water. If you want to talk about rights, this sounds insane, but they actually say if we don't stop this, if we don't maintain and retain water in watersheds, that we're drying up the planet, and we trade water out of watersheds in something called virtual water trade.
I want to get to that. First, climate change. Does this have anything to do
Climate change has everything to do with it, but this water also has everything to do with climate change. Climate change affects water dramatically in the glacier melts, in the ice cover. For instance, the Great Lakes don't have the ice pack they used to have, and so the Great Lakes are evaporating faster than they should be. So climate change from greenhouse gas emissions affects water. But what I'm posing in this book, and the scientists I'm working with are posing, is that our pollution, displacement, and mismanagement of water is also a factor in creating climate change. It's not just that water crisis is a result, but it's a factor. And this matters because you hear, I call it the climate change made me do it syndrome. You hear politicians saying, well, there's nothing we can do about that because it's climate change and it came from away. Most recently, I was in Australia where they've hit the water wall. The Prime Minister is saying it's climate change, didn't come from here, and therefore, there's nothing we're doing about water or could do about water that makes a difference, and that's just absolute nonsense. They're destroying their water tables. They're exporting massive amounts of it to China.
Yeah, because it's not like, we should explain to our viewers, because of this hydrological system, it's not like the water is evaporating and going away into another planet or anything.
But we have rendered it useless. We have taken it from where we can access it through aquifers, like the Ogallala Aquifer, which goes down the spine of the west of the United States. They're taking it up 14 times. They've got 200,000 bore wells going 24/7, taking it up 14 times faster than it can be replenished by nature, and they're running out. And then they go and they build more high rises and swimming pools and golf courses and huge agribusiness in the desert, and there's no water.
Well, let's talk about that, because a lot of people, when they talk about water shortages, water contamination, they associate this with the developing world problem. I mean, you make the point in this book that in Arizona right now, they import 100% of their drinking water. How big a problem is the Southwest United States in terms of water right now?
It's not just the Southwest in the United States. Most of the United States is coming up to a water crisis. The Environmental Protection Agency has said that 36 states are in crisis, from serious to severe is their language. Now, the Southwest and the Midwest are the worst, but they've just come out with a new report saying that the southeastern states of the United States are also in trouble. Part of it is where people are moving. They're moving in massive amounts into those desert areas, and building industry and industrial agriculture that just simply there's just no water for it. They plan, subsidized biofuel crop growth, huge amounts. I've got a stat in here where California's planned biofuel. This is where you try to ease the greenhouse gas emissions and the fossil fuel use by using land to grow food for cars, right? Uses an enormous amount of water. They have planned biofuel expansion in California for which they have no water. It's like one arm of government's over here planning this, and another arm of government is or is not looking at the water issue. So it's a crisis. The Midwest is the driest in 500 years. And I remember with just such clarity a conference I was at in Boise, Idaho last year, put on by the governor, where one water manager and one scientist after another got up and said, read my lips, read our lips, this is not a drought.
I'm sure there's viewers out there who are thinking, oh, this is terrible for the rest of the world. Lucky Canada is going to escape this problem. We're water rich. You say this is a myth.
Yes.
Explain that.
A big myth. You will read over and over that we have 20% of the world's available water. This is not true. The only way this would be true is if we drained every lake and every river in Canada, and then we would be a big desert. We have about 6.5% of the available fresh water. And even that's not quite accurate, because 90% of us live in the south and we have about 2.5. The rest of it's in great big rivers that run north into the north. And to get at that water would mean reversing the flow of that water, which would mean huge engineering projects the size of Three Gorges Dam, which you want to think about real carefully before you do it. So you want to start conserving. Moreover, we have our own problems. We have all the problems that exist in the world are existing here. We have declining Great Lakes. We take, or collectively around the lakes, we take 4 trillion liters a year from those lakes. There is not 4 trillion liters of water going back in. There are bore wells so deep on the Lake Michigan side, on the western side of Lake Michigan, they go down as deep into the aquifers as skyscrapers go up in the sky, right? And they are pumping that stuff so hard they've reversed the flow of Lake Michigan, and they're now taking in Lake Michigan water. That's why the Great Lakes are going down. We've got a crisis in northern Alberta with a 5-fold expansion of the tar sands plant, where for every unit of oil we extract from the tar sands, 3 to 5 units of water is destroyed. If they go ahead with this 5-fold increase, Alberta will become a water have-not province. We have 1,300 melting glaciers, and these glaciers feed the water sources in northern Canada, particularly in the west, and they will be major loss. We have no national laws to protect drinking water, for drinking water standards, for sewage dumping, for toxic dumping. We don't have a commercial ban on the export of water. We have just had this notion that we have so much, it doesn't matter what we do with it. We can pollute, we can waste it, we can be an exporter of bottled water, which we are, and it doesn't matter. And the day of reckoning is going to come pretty soon, I do believe.
Now, you also claimed, when we started this conversation, one of the things that got you into this issue was NAFTA.
Yep.
You make the claim that the U.S. is eyeing our water. I mean, where's the evidence of that?
There's lots of evidence, and there's a whole chapter in here that tells the history of it. There are lots of little hints. I mean, just things like when I was on National CBC last year with Paul Cellucci, who was the former ambassador to Canada from the U.S., and he started off the debate saying, "Oh, Maude, what's wrong with selling your water to us?" And I thought that wasn't a coincidence. So there's lots of those kind of little things that remind me, Alan, of 20 years ago when we were first said that our energy was going to become continental energy, and that happened. We went from 25% of our energy production for export to the U.S. to 70%. And I can taste all the same kind of hints and so on. But very specifically, something happened recently, and that is that under the Security and Prosperity Partnership for North America, which is this deal between the 3 heads of the state, to merge the notion of prosperity and security, merging no-fly lists and that kind of thing. We've signed a resource pact, which, we kept saying, well, why is it called resource? If it's about energy, then why don't you say energy? Does not include water? Suddenly, water has moved up the top of the ladder as a national security interest in the United States. And there's a think tank called CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, linked to the Sandia Laboratories, which is a Pentagon-based laboratory now being run by Lockheed Martin, the world's biggest weapons manufacturer. They've come together on a project called Global Water Futures, and they are now advising the U.S. government and the Pentagon on water as a national security issue. Not coincidentally, I believe, the same group was hired by through the SPP, the Security and Prosperity Partnership, to do a think piece on security and environment. And they were to have held a closed-door meeting in Calgary this past May. Only I got a hold of the agenda in a brown paper bag, and we let it out to the world and the media and so on, and everybody backed off. Even the Canadian delegation flew to Calgary and then turned around and got on a plane and flew home. They didn't even go to the meeting. That's how hot this is. But one of the journalists talked to the head of this Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he said, of course we're talking about Canada's water.
So let me just understand. We're to believe that right now, under the Security and Prosperity partnership between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, that we have Canadian people sitting down talking about the exporting of bulk water?
Well, they were about to, we caught them, and so they were forced to open up the process. And we got a call from the American Embassy, and we met with the American Embassy, not the ambassador, but the most senior people below him, and a man named John Dixon, who is the senior bureaucrat there. We talked very openly about it, and I said to him, how come the Security and Prosperity Partnership hasn't gone to the legislatures of the three countries? And he said,
we should understand
we didn't want another bruising NAFTA battle.
This is behind closed doors. This is not
quiet. There are 20 cross-border working groups right now harmonizing every level of environmental, health, safety, food standards, and if it's to George Bush's standards, they're going down. But we don't have access to much of that information. We suspected water was on the table, but we didn't have any proof until we got a hold of this. And as I say, the head of this think tank, this CSIS think tank in the U.S., said openly, "Oh yeah, of course we're talking about Canada's water." Now, what I think has happened as a result of our having caught them is that it's all gone quiet for now. But you don't have. I mean, they're holding prayer meetings in Atlanta, Georgia, on the state capitol, praying for rain. I mean, we're not talking about a cyclical drought. We're talking about people up against the water wall who have not dealt with the fact that they're building, these enormous cities and these enormous communities and industries in the desert. So, it doesn't take a lot of brain power, I think, to realize that, of course, they're going to have to be thinking about Canada's water. They're also thinking about the Guarani Aquifer, which is a major aquifer in Latin America, where they've started placing military bases, saying that they're looking for terrorists. Well, there aren't terrorists there. There's water there. So we need to understand that this has suddenly become a geopolitical issue, with the United States seeing water as important as energy in terms of maintaining its global status as a superpower. And that, Alan, that's the thing I guess I want to say most seriously here, is that because we are displacing water and unable to get at it and pumping it faster than it can be replenished, 23 million bore wells in India alone, exponentially pumping this stuff up, we're now having what scientists call hotspots in the world. These are places that are running out of water. The Middle East, all of northern China. China's going to get their water from the Tibetan Himalaya, the glaciers, and they're going to take the water by pipeline that now feeds 5 major rivers of Asia. You want to talk about a coming war. Mexico City's sinking on itself. They don't have any water left. 22 countries in Africa. Australia's absolutely hit the water wall, and now major parts of the United States. So this is not a kind of cyclical thing. It's not a third world issue. This is a global crisis, and I argue that water is the first face of climate change. It's the area where we already have refugees. It's the area where governments are just beginning to scramble to keep up.
You also say that if we are going to reverse what is going to become a bad situation that will get worse, that it has to start by recognizing that water is a human right, yes, and not a human need. What does that mean, and what's the implication for that recognition?
What has happened is, because water is so scarce and because there are so many of us needing it and chasing it, it has become extraordinarily valuable. So what's happening is that there's a creation of a global water cartel taking place. very, very like the energy cartel that now exists, so that one day, possibly, when a new find of water is discovered, it's owned before it's taken out of the ground by a company. So right now we've got the big service companies from France, all over the third world, coming into the North America as well, delivering water for profit and denying it to those who can't afford it.
We should make the point, because we don't have private water companies here. This is big business.
This is huge business, and they're not in here as a service, and they're meeting such resistance in the global south. And I show how what happened in the 15 years of forced privatization of water services in the global south by the World Bank, there's been a net decrease, a net outflow of money from the north to the global south for water at a time when it was expanding.
Why? What about the genius of private enterprise?
They assumed the private companies would put money into it, and they were wrong. The private companies are there to make money,
no money
not
in conservation.
putting into it. There's no money in conservation, and there's no money in social justice. So they're not there to provide water for the poor, and they're not there to help conserve water in water-declining countries.
Make this real for me. Give me an example of where they have privatized water and where you say it's a failure.
Oh, everywhere. But I'll just give you one place just recently that I was in, El Alto, Bolivia, in La Paz, which is the capital of the poorest, one of the poorest countries in Latin America. Suez came in, the same company that built the Suez Canal, made an agreement to build, not to deny water to people. They just built a great big fortress around the water melt coming off Mount Illimani. They've got guns and guards and stuff to keep the local people out. They promised in writing that there would be an agreement for wastewater treatment. They built these tunnels, these canals, and they, right through places where people live, they dumped the raw sewage, they dumped the raw garbage. I stood downstream from an abattoir and watched where the blood and the stuff coming out of the abattoir is being dumped directly by Suez into Lake Titicaca. And if people want their sewage piped up into this, they have to pay. The week before I was there, a child had fallen in and died, and I mean, this is obscene. The story is documented, well documented, to the point that the United Nations, which was promoting privatization in the third world, has now changed its position and said
why
governments
would
have to come
the United
in.
States or the IMF promote privatization in this
Well, they
instance?
bought this whole notion of this Washington consensus agenda that although most of the systems in the North are public, they can make money on this, and it's an opportunity for their corporations to go in. I talked to a politician with the European Parliament who said, and I said, most of the systems, water systems in Europe are public. Why are you pushing your big private companies on the global south? And he said, because in Europe we know how to do it with public funds, but he said these people in the third world don't know how to do these things, so we have to send our companies in to teach them and to run their services for them. I mean, it was just short of racist, and maybe not very short at all. What the situation for a lot of the third world is, they don't have the money because they're sending so much money back to the north in terms of debt, debt payments, that they can't provide these services, and it could be done in a different way on a non-profit. Not saying there's no place for the private sector, but they should not be running water services for profit and denying water to millions of people. And Alan, every single day, more children in our world die of dirty water than HIV, AIDS, war, malaria, and accidents put together. It's the #1 killer.
You do make the point, though, in that regard, that nanotechnology may allow us to basically recycle dirty water. Yet you have concerns there, too.
Big concerns. This is the fastest growing area of the water cartel, the water business. There's the water services, there's bottled water, which is something like 200 billion liters of water we put in plastic bottles around the world, which is last year creating mountains of garbage. And now there's this new water recycling, water reuse. I'm not saying there's no place for that, obviously, that would be crazy, and we do need gray water use and all of that. But what I'm finding, what I found in the book, is that particularly the American government is putting massive amounts of money into research on desalination, nuclear-powered desalination, nanotechnology, atmospheric water generators, think big humidifiers, like, in the air. And big companies like General Electric, Procter & Gamble, Dow Chemical, the folks who brought us, Bhopal, do you trust them with your water, are all getting into this, and suddenly water is on the stock exchange. It's one of the hottest commodities.
Your current concern is that it raises the question of who owns the water once it's been cleaned.
Who owns the water once it's been cleaned? If the bottled water companies own bottled water when they sell it, why wouldn't these companies be able to claim they own it? But also, I think it's a direct disincentive to protect source water. And for a long time, I've wondered why the UN Millennium Goals for water, which is that half the people in the world now without water should be hooked up by 2015, which is just never going to happen. I mean, they're like 200 years is going to take at the rate they're going. But that I always wondered why that wasn't accompanied by strict rules and strict planning around stopping the pollution. Alan, the most important thing that we could do is stop polluting. And yet, when that's not a goal, you have to wonder: is there gold in them there hills in that dirty water? And is that the reason that we're not? This isn't in the language of anything that we're doing internationally.
Under NAFTA, as you point out, water is a tradable good.
Yeah.
The general consensus or general feeling is, well, NAFTA is a done deal. There's nothing we can do about that. Is there?
Well, I argue that the United States abrogated NAFTA when it refused to abide by the softwood lumber agreement rulings. And it basically said the parts of NAFTA that are good for us, we will live by, and the parts that aren't, we won't. And I argue that we need to bring in we need a water strategy in Canada, and it has to have an ecological piece, and it has to have a jurisdictional piece.
You're calling for National Freshwater Act.
Absolutely. And we've actually done work with a number of other groups, and we've drafted what that act should look like, which is up on our website, Canadians.org, and we're really going to be promoting it through public dialogue because we're not waiting for the government. So a number of groups have actually drafted this. But what we're also calling for is a national ban on the commercial export of water before it's too late. And if that violates NAFTA, so be it. We also have to support the right to water at the United Nations, which would also violate the notion of water as a commodity. But if a piece of NAFTA wasn't acceptable to the Americans and a piece of NAFTA isn't acceptable to us, I don't see why we're any more committed to it than they were. This is our national security issue, and if Canadians want to lose control of our water, sit back and do nothing because it's about to happen.
Stephen Harper government recently introduced a water initiative. The Royal Bank of Canada just put $60 million into a fund.
Yeah.
Is the rest of the world, the rest of our political leaders starting to get hip to this?
Beginning to start doing, the Royal Bank, that initiative, we know it will be helpful. It's about pipeline building, and it's about digging wells and so on. And I keep arguing there isn't enough water in the ground to keep
dig it
doing
out.
We've got to
Guy
stop
Liberté
seeing.
from Cirque du Soleil has
Same
made
thing,
this water
same
his
thing. Wonderful project, and I know what he's doing, and I've met with them, and it's great. But we all need to have a more political analysis. You keep pumping that water out of the ground and keep allowing the pollution of surface water, mining, and all of the things that we're doing that we're not addressing, we will run out of groundwater. So it's not just a case of hooking up people to groundwater, and that's what most of those big funds are going towards. It's the charity model, it's not the solidarity model, and it doesn't touch the issues around too much growth too fast, too much corporate power, and so on. The Harper government, just to say that the initiative is pretty small stuff compared to the cuts they've made to the environment. And the fact that they will not support a serious greenhouse gas emission program. So, yes, it's good to hear a beginning, and we're certainly dialoguing with all of the other parties. The Liberals, the NDP, and the Bloc, and the Greens have all taken a beginning of some very good and some pretty good. I'm quite impressed. The Liberals, for instance, are calling for a Secretary of State for water, that all of the water departments together. There's 20 water departments that they should all be working together and be brought into one super department or ministry. So that's exciting. And we're, the NDP, the Bloc, the Greens have all taken very strong positions. So suddenly we are aligning a constellation of interests, and I think you're going to see an explosion of interest. I can tell by the interest in this book.
Well, but would you say what we really need is a blue covenant?
Covenant, yeah.
What is that? Describe that.
A blue covenant is a covenant of from humanity to the earth that understands that water does not belong to anybody. It belongs to the earth, all species, and is a fundamental human right. It belongs to future generations as well, and that we will stop destroying it or we're all going to die. And the poor will die first, but it will not, nobody will survive what we're doing to the planet. It's also a covenant from the rich world to the poor world, of solidarity to the notion of justice for all and water for all, which means forgiving the debt in many cases, which means real transfer of resources so that the global south isn't dying of thirst. And the third part of it is a covenant to democracy, that nobody should be allowed to appropriate water for profit. It's not like cups or tables or running shoes. You can't live without it, and it is part of our public commons. It's a public trust. And therefore we're seeking a blue covenant at the United Nations that describes and codifies water as a human right. Very, very exciting. The Federation of Municipalities in Nova Scotia just passed a resolution that water is a human right. It's coming up everywhere.
Well, and this whole notion of a blue covenant is embraced by what you call the International Water Justice Movement, of
Yes.
which you're a leading member. I mean, are you winning the battle these days? Are you winning more than this?
Unbelievably, we're winning. This is the most exciting and wonderful story. I've got a whole chapter in here called The Water Warriors Fight Back. And this is where local people around the world are just telling their governments or these corporations to get their act together. And sometimes they're claiming their water rights. They're actually just a little place at Barnstead, New Hampshire. I was just there. It's one of those, if you blink, as you go by. They're fighting Poland Springs, which is a big Nestle's company, which is sucking the water, like New England. And the Guelph area where I just was, for instance, these are areas that the water hunters are coming in to pull the water out of the ground. And so this little community couldn't get their politicians to do anything, so 136 of them got together in somebody's barn and they passed a local ordinance that their water is theirs and then Poland Springs and damn well better stay out, and they've kept them out. And so it's happening from the very local level to countries like Uruguay, which 3 years ago became the first country in the world to hold a referendum on its national ballot that forced a constitutional amendment that water is a human right. And up to the UN, where our own Louise Arbour, who is the High Commissioner for Human Rights, has been tasked with coming up with a plan for a convention or some kind of legal protection around water. So it's very exciting, happening at the most local level, right up to national, right up to international. And I'm hopeful that one day it will be understood that this is not a commodity like other things, and that there are certain areas that maybe should be taken out of the market. And if ever there was one, it's water.